Hello guys and welcome to this video. In today's video, we're going to learn how to create apps using Tkinter, which is a Python built-in library for making graphical user interfaces. Tkinter is great because it is simple to use, requires no extra installation, and works across different operating systems. Before we start, I highly recommend checking out the Tkinter documentation. It is the official source and will help you a lot as you explore more features beyond what we'll cover in this video. You'll find it by searching for Tkinter documentation Python on Google or visiting the Python official documentation. Now let's get started. Now let's try to set up Tkinter inside of our script. So what we need to do is to first import Tkinter. Then after importing it, we'll create a basic application window. So let's get started. So I'll import Tkinter as tk here. So this tk is my alias for the Tkinter library. And anytime I want to access any function or any class inside this Tkinter library, let's need to use the tk as reference. Now let's create our main application window. So this main application window will hold all the widgets and buttons and whatever that we might create inside our application. So I'll create a variable called root, then set it to tk function. So this tk function will create the main application window for us. So after creating our main application window, let's now set the title of the window. So to set the title of the window, we'll have root.title followed by parentheses. Then inside the parentheses, I have my first Tkinter app. So after my first Tkinter app, let's now take a look at how to set the window size, because we don't want the window to span across the full page. So to set the window size, we can define both the width and the height. So define the width, we use the geometry function. So inside the geometry, we have root.geometry followed by parentheses. Then inside this parentheses, we're going to have 400 x 300. So this will define the window's width and the height. So after we now set the window size, let's now take a look at how to run the application. Now to run the application, we just have root.main loop. So this main loop function basically keeps the window running until we close it. And so now when I run the script, you see that a blank window will appear, and we'll see that we get the title my first Tkinter app on the blank window. So that is basically how we can set up Tkinter inside of our programs. The next section, we'll be taking a look at how to add labels and buttons to our Tkinter apps. Now let's see how we can add text and a button to our application window. So to do that, I'll first create a variable called label, then set it to tk label followed by parentheses. Then inside the parentheses is going to reference to the application window, that is root, then followed by the text that you are going to display onto our application window, and that will be hello Tkinter. And so to display this text onto our application window, we'll have load.pack, and so when I run this, you see that our application window is going to display hello Tkinter on it. So we have basically added a text to our application window. Now let's take a look at how we can style this text inside our application window. So Tkinter provides us with the ability to style the text inside this application window. So to do that, inside my .label function, I'm going to have another parameter which is font, and the font is going to take in the font family and the font size. So I have Arial. The Arial is going to represent the font family. Then font size is going to be 16. Then after that, we're going to add some padding to it so that we can ensure that there is spacing for elements inside this application window. So to do that, inside my .pack function, I'm going to have paddy set to 10. And so when we now run this, we'll see that our application window, we are going to get hello Tkinter, and we'll see that our font family is Arial and our font size will be 16. So this is how we can basically add text or text label inside of Tkinter. Let's now take a look at how to add buttons to our Tkinter application window. To do that, I also have button variable, which is going to be set to tk.button followed by parentheses. Then we'll reference our application window. So after referencing our application window, we need to place a text inside our button. So to place a text inside of our button, we'll set our text parameter to click me. So after that, we will now have to display this button onto application window. So display this button onto application window, have button.pack, and so when I run this, you see that you're going to get our button click me on our application window. And one thing that the button also provides is that when user clicks on the button, we can make the button to perform a specific task when user clicks on it. So to do that, we also include something called the command argument or parameter. So I'll set the command argument inside my button class, then it is going to take a lambda function. So in this lambda function, we're going to have label.config. So this config function will basically change the label that we stated earlier, and that was the hello Tkinter. So what we are basically telling it is that they will now set the text inside the config to be button clicked. So we are basically telling the Tkinter library that anytime a user clicks on this button, it should replace the hello Tkinter text with button clicked. And so after adding this command, let's add some padding to our button. So I have a padding of 10. And so when I now run this, we see that we get our button here. And so when I now click on the button, you see that it's going to change the hello Tkinter text to button clicked. So that is how we can basically create buttons inside Tkinter and also trigger events using the command parameter inside of Tkinter. So in the next section, we'll be taking a look at how to create an input field, or an entry widget, so that users can type in something. Now, to add an input field into our application window, what you need to do is first to create a variable called entry, and I'll set it to tk.entry function. And inside the entry function, we reference to our application window, since we are creating it inside our application window. Then after that, I'm going to set a font area and font size of 14. So after we now create our entry widget, what we now have to do is now display it onto our application window. To display it onto our application window, we follow the same procedure as we did for the label and the button. We'll have entry.pack, and inside entry.pack, we'll have a padding of 10. So after creating this, when I run this application, we see that we get our entry widget displayed here. And so when I start typing, you see that we get our font and our font size also having an effect. Now let's take a look at how we can collect this input from our entry widget. And after collecting this input, we'll now use it to do something. So let's get started. So I'll define a function called update_label. Then inside this update_label function, I have label.config. So this label.config will modify our label that we previously created in the other section, and we are modifying only the text, and the text is going to be you have entered plus, and that is string concatenation plus entry.get. So the .get method will retrieve the text that we type into our entry widget. So this is how we can get the user input. So after getting the user input, let's now take a look at creating a submit button, so that when the user clicks on the submit button, this function will be called. So to do that, I'll create a button called submit_button that is going to be set to tk.button. Then we'll reference to our main application window, that is root. Then the text for the button is going to submit. Then our command will be update_label. So you're basically calling the function update underscore label when we click on this button. So now to display this button on our application window, we'll have submit underscore button dot pack. Then we'll set a padding of 10. And so when I now run this application window, we'll see that we get our application window with our input field, then the button submit. And so when I now type in, let's say hello, then click on the button, we'll see that our label text is going to be updated and it's going to be, we have entered hello. And when I also type in, let's say hello or either Alice, we'll see that we get our label widget updated. So that is basically how we can get user input inside of Tkinter and display it on our console or on our application window. So in the next section, we'll be taking a look at how to create a simple counter app with what we have learned so far in this tutorial. Now to create our simple counter app, what we need to do in this app is that we are going to make a counter app so that when clicking on a button, this button will increase the number as we click on it. So let's get started. So to get started, we need to create a count variable. So this count variable will be set to 0 initially. So after creating our count variable, we'll now have to define the function that will cause the count variable to increase when our button is triggered. So to do that, I'll define a function called increase. Then inside this count function, I'll set global to count. So after setting global to count, I'll now have count plus equal to 1. And this assignment operator. So this will basically add 1 to the counter anytime this function is called or triggered. What we now have to do is that we now have to update our counter label so that anytime we increase our count, it will be updated and printed onto or shown onto our application window. So to do that, we have to update it inside of our function. Since every time we trigger the count, it is affected inside the function. So to do that, I have counter underscore label dot config, and inside this, we are going to update only the text of our label. It's going to be an F string that takes in the update of our count variable. So the counter underscore label hasn't been defined yet. I'll define it later. So now after we are done with this function, let's now take a look at defining our counter underscore label and our count underscore button for the application. So my counter underscore label variable will be set to tk.label. That takes in a root as reference. Then we'll have text, which is going to be set to count is to 0. Then we'll have a font of Arial, then font size of 16. Then we'll now display our label, which is counter underscore label dot pack, followed by parentheses. Then have a padding of 10. So we'll now see our label displayed on our application window. Now let's take a look at how to create our button for this counter app. So I'll define a variable called count underscore button, then set it to tk.button class. And inside the button, we are referencing it to the root of our application. Then we'll now set text to increase for the button. Then we'll now set our command to increase. So anytime we click on the button, it's going to call the increase function. So after that, we'll now have count underscore button dot pack. Then we'll set a padding of 10. And so when we run this, we'll see that we get our application window with our count set to 0, then our count button also, which is increase. And when I start clicking on the button, we'll see that our count label keeps on updating. So that is basically how we can create a counter app using the Tkinter library. So this app will help you to understand how to handle user interactions inside of Tkinter. So in the next section, we're taking a look at how to use frames for layout inside of our Tkinter application. So if, let's say, your app has multiple widgets, sometimes using frames can help organize them better. So let's get started on how to use frames for layout. Now I'll define a variable called frame, then set it to tk.frame followed by parentheses. And inside the parentheses, we're going to set it to root. So we are basically giving the frame function access to the root window so that it can help us manipulate the layout of our app. So after doing this, we now have to display the layout onto our application window. So I have frame.pack that's going to take a padding of 10. So when I run this, we'll see that we get nothing on our console. So now let's take a look at how we can organize our widgets using this frame function. So I'll create label 1, then set it to tk.label. That will now take frame as the reference since we are now using frame inside of our layout. Then we'll now have a text of label 1, then a font of Arial with font size 12. Then I have label 1.pack. Then inside this pack function, we're going to have side, which is going to be set to left. So the side set to left will align widgets horizontally inside the frame. And I'll set a padding X of 5. Then I'll create another label also, which is going to be label 2. And it's going to be set to tk.label. That will take the same frame, then a text of label 2, then font Arial and 12 of size. Then I'll have label 2.pack that is also going to take side of left. Then I want to take a padding X of 5. And so when I now run this, we'll see in our application window that these two labels has been aligned horizontally inside of our frames. That is how we can basically lay out or perform layout using Tkinter. In the next section, we'll be taking a look at how to add a drop-down menu or an option menu widget to our applications. So we are going to add a drop-down menu so that users can select options from this drop-down menu. So first, I'll create a variable called options, then set it to a list of strings option 1, option 2, then option 3. So after creating this list, now we are going to create a variable called selected_option, and I'll set it to tk.string_var. Then inside the string var, I'm going to have value is going to be set to options. Then the options will be set to the index of 0 inside this list. So basically what the selected_option stores is that it is going to store the first element inside of the options list, which is option 1. So the string var function is a Tkinter variable that holds a string value. So it is particularly useful for keeping track of and updating values of graphical user interface widgets. So let's now take a look at creating our drop-down menu. So to create our drop-down menu, I'll create a variable called drop-down, then set it to tk.option_menu. Then inside the option menu, we'll reference it to our root. Then after that, we are going to take another parameter, which is the selected_option. Then the selected_option, we are now going to add a list of options that we are going to display inside the drop-down. So to do that, we'll have asterisk options. So now to display the drop-down menu inside of our window, we'll have drop-down.pack that takes in a padding of 10. And so when I now run this, we see that we are going to get a drop-down menu with our options, option 1, option 2, then option 3. So that is basically how we can create the drop-down menu inside of Tkinter. Now let's take a look at how to add some functionality to the options inside of our drop-down menu. So to add the functionalities, I'll define a function called show_selection. And inside the show_selection, I'm going to have label.config that takes in text as the parameter that we are going to change. Then it's going to have selected. Then it's going to display selected_option.get. So the .get will get which option that we are selecting, then print it out when we select that option on our application window. So we'll now create a button so that when we select an option and click on the button to trigger the command show underscore selection function. So I'll create a variable called select underscore button, then set it to tk.button. That takes in the root as our application window, then take in text, which is show selection. Then our command will be the call of show underscore selection function. Then after that, we'll now display the select underscore button widget, and it will take a padding of 10. And so when I now run the application and now choose, let's say, option 1, then click on the button, you see our choice displayed. When I also do that for the first and the second option, we'll see that our label will get updated onto our application. So that is basically how we can add drop-down menu and add some functionality to each option inside of our drop-down. So in the next section, we'll be taking a look at how to add a message box or a pop-up dialog inside of our application window. Before we can add or show pop-up messages using the message box or the message box widget, we will first need to import it from Tkinter. So I'll come here, then from Tkinter, I'm going to import message box. Then after importing message box, we are going to define a function, and the function is going to show the message in which we want to display on the app. So I define a function called show underscore message that is going to take in message box dot show info. So there are so many other functions inside of message box, but I won't cover in this video. I will take a look at it in a full course on Tkinter, and it is going to take information. So the first information represent the title of our message box. Then the following string will represent the purpose of the message box. That is, this is a pop-up message. So now let's define a button that will trigger this message box. So to do that, I'll create a variable called msg underscore button. Then I'll set it to tk.button. That is going to take in root, comma, text. The text is going to be show message. Then I'm going to take a command of the call of our function, which is show underscore message. So anytime we click on this button, it's going to trigger the function. And we'll now have to display our button, which is going to be msg underscore button dot spark. That's going to take a padding of 10. And so when I now run this and click on the message button, you see that we are going to get our pop-up message, which is going to indicate our title and indicate the content of the message, which is going to be, this is a pop-up message. So this message box is useful for alerts, confirmations, and error messages in our apps. So Tkinter has built-in versatility for all these issues when building apps with Tkinter. Now that we now have a basic understanding of how the Tkinter library works, let's now take a look at how to build a to-do list app. So we are going to put everything that we have learned so far to build a simple to-do list app to fully understand how the Tkinter library works. So let's get started. I'll start by defining a variable called tasks, then setting it to an empty list. Store the to-do items entered by. Then after that, we are going to define an add underscore task function. In this function, we are going to a task is equal to entry.get. So this will get the text entered by the user from the entry widget or the text input field, then store it inside a task variable. And if task, it is going to check if the task variable is empty, and if the user has entered something, it is going to add the task to our task list. If it is not empty, then we are going to call the update underscore list function to refresh the list box with the updated task list. Then after that, it's going to clear the content of the entry widget so that the user can enter a new task again. So now let's define our update underscore list function. So this function is going to update the content of the list box widget. So I'll have list box dot delete followed by parentheses. That is going to take in 0, tk.end. So this will basically clear the existing items inside the list box. Then we are going to have for tags in tags. This is going to iterate through each tags in the tags list. Then it's going to insert each tags in the list box at the end. And it's going to be listbox.insert tk.end tags. Then after that, let's now define our Tkinter widgets. So to define our Tkinter widgets, I'll define my entry widget, which is going to be set to tk.entry. That takes in root, then a font of Arial, then font size of 14. And I'll display the widget onto my application window with a padding of 10. Now let's add the button to our application window. So I'll define a variable called add_button that is going to take in tk.button, that will take in root, then text of add tags. Then we are going to add the command of add_tags. So this command will trigger the add_tags function anytime we click on the add_button widget. So now when I try to display the add_button.pack with a padding of 5. Now to display the list box also inside of our application window, we'll have list box is equal to tk.listbox. That is going to take in root, font of an Arial, then a font size of 14. Then we are going to have listbox.pack. That is going to take a vertical padding of 10. And so when we now run our application window, then we ask our users to enter or type in a tags. So inside our entry widget, I'll type in, let's say, hello, then click add tags. Then we'll see that it is going to appear inside of our list box. And when I also add another tags and click on add tags, you see that it's going to appear on the list box. So that is basically how we can create a simple to-do list app using what you have learned so far. So this is just a simple introduction to creating graphical user interfaces application with Tkinter. So we have covered how to create windows and widgets, handle user inputs, organizing layouts, then using drop-down menus. So remember to explore the Tkinter documentation for more advanced features. If you have found this helpful, like the video, subscribe for more Python tutorials, then drop a comment below. See you in the next video.